welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So, veteran, I knew you when you were Consul General in New York, and you have headed that operation for longer than any other official. You're very well aware of dealing with between your country and other countries, especially the US, which is very worried now. Even here in the UK, right, you're on business, but you're having to talk to many people in this country who are worried and curious about what's happening in your country. What can you say to them?
So the level of curiosity is amazing because we've never had anything like this in Israel's history, although we did have some cases of people that the very fact that they were elected to hold high positions created a very high level of anxiety. For example, when Menachem Begin was elected in 1977, organized American Jewry was very much against it, and they made it known. Ariel Sharon is another case of someone who, the fact that he became a minister under Menachem Begin caused a great deal of anxiety. Avigdor Lieberman is another name. But I think this time, because of the uniqueness and the fact that this is a solid right-of-center coalition, the level of curiosity, and I may say in some places anxiety, is very, very high, especially in the Jewish world.
So you say right-of-center, but we described it as extreme right, and most people are describing it as very far-right, and the Prime Minister-to-be himself said far-right nationalist, policy. So,
right. So
this is different in that regard, too. I mean, it's way off the scale that you've had before.
And there's one particular reason for that perception, and that's one party. It's actually a platform, a merger of 3 different parties that won 14 seats. And that party's name is Jewish Power or Jewish Strength or Jewish Might, which the name by itself, many people think is disturbing. Because if you are powerful, why declaring it? And the leaders of that party, particularly 3 people, have made declarations in the past that there's no other way to describe them other than revolutionary.
Revolutionary?
Yes.
And what does that mean in an Israeli modern 2022 sense?
It means that they are looking, we're all familiar with the traditional definition of populism. It's the narrative that says we, the people, against the elite. Here, it's a different form of populism. It's we, the people, against the establishment, against the institutions of the state. And they're targeting, and they made public references, to the need to overhaul the court system, even the defense ministry, even the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. They claim it's too soft, and so on and so forth. So Israelis, there are many Israelis, by the way, including Israelis that voted for the right-of-center bloc, because there are many ways to look at the outcome of the elections, but including Israelis that vote for the right-of-center bloc that find those statements very disturbing, and I don't think they anticipated them to win 14 seats, which is more than 10% of the number of the member of the Knesset.
So when you say, statements that are disturbing, I mean, as I mentioned, some have been openly homophobic. Some of these leaders have suggested that men shouldn't be shaking hands with women. Some have been considered even too extreme by the IDF to even conscript them during times of national service. One of them, this is Itamar Ben-Gvir, has a conviction for inciting anti-Arab racism. And we remember that terrible explosion of bloodletting inside Israel. We'd never seen that before. He has been convicted for inciting that and supporting terrorism. Now, he is positioned to lead the National Security Ministry. What does that mean? Again, the United States is concerned that these types of people may have to deal with them on issues of national security and other things.
I think the Secretary of State took the right position. We can't judge them by past statements. You have to wait and see what they will be actually doing. And I think that Prime Minister-elect Netanyahu pacified the concerns of many people by saying, I will be Prime Minister for the entire nation. However, the concern is that the people from that particular party, their understanding of democracy is very procedural. We won the elections, and therefore we're going to do what we want. And in fact, one of the members of the Knesset that is a member of that party actually said it on television. deal with it, basically. That's what he said. We're going to do whatever we want because we want. This is a very technical definition of democracy.
Right, and it's one that is about power, and it's not about being, as Benjamin Netanyahu said, for all Israeli citizens, right? It's about being for their group and their supporters and what you're describing as a very hardline version of a Torah-led religious government. Is that what you're saying by revolutionary?
Yes, and I think it goes beyond that. It's the entire issue of governance, for example. The belief that the court system is actually an impediment in the process of proper governance, which is exactly the opposite. The Israeli Supreme Court, historically, is known for actually making life much easier for the Israeli government in the family of nations, with some very, very creative and interesting rulings that are serving as a model for other high courts of justice all over the world. Mm-hmm. So, and you can ask yourself, why is this happening? This is happening because the political conversation all over the world, and Israel is no exception, is a conversation that lacks nuance. We can't deal with complexity anymore. It has a lot to do with the impact of information overload. And we do live in the age of information overload. Has tremendous implications on political life.
So before I get to some of the more specifics, there's another gentleman, Smotrich. He'll have authority over the policy on Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank, relations with the Palestinians. And this looks to be, yet another excuse to keep annexing, to keep Israeli authority, to move back from the two-state solution. I'm going to ask you about that. But when you talk about this situation where the people have gone to the polls and elected these people, it also had one of the largest turnouts in the last 20 years, apparently 70.1% turnout. You've just talked about information overload. But the polls show that so many Israelis, particularly Israeli Jews, particularly in the 18 to 24 age group, the number who identify themselves as right-wing is at 70%.
It's probably more than that.
But that's unusual too, historically, isn't it? Or not?
Well, depends. Mm-hmm. There's an historical context here that has to be considered. The Israelis developed, obviously, based on generations of persecution, obviously the Holocaust, a very strong, I call it a siege mentality, acutely aware of the threats surrounding them. They respond to threats very well, and they have a tendency to undermine opportunity. And that's a result of a very bloody history of persecution. Now, obviously, the fact that the Palestinians never really showed any their diplomacy was all or nothing diplomacy, zero-sum diplomacy didn't help. I'll give you an example. Their rejection of the Clinton plan in 2000, their response to Ariel Sharon's unilateral pullout in 2005, the rejection of the Ehud Olmert plan in 2008. All those things convinced Israelis, even left-of-center Israelis, that the conflict is no longer about land, but rather about our very right to exist. And that really changed the political landscape. Okay, so
fast forward. I mean, that was in something, I think it was 2000, and even Yasser Arafat said, I wish we'd accepted the Clinton parameters. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of problems there. But, to be fair, your politicians have always said, we don't have a partner on that side, we're not going to talk to them. And that also is untrue. But what do you think? Because we're also hearing there's a lot of dissatisfaction amongst young people, young Palestinians with this state of affairs, that the whole area is potentially, about to maybe show some Iran-style or China-style protests. Do you see that? Are you reading that?
It may happen. Some commentators believe that this is an inevitable scenario, meaning this government is going to be tested, this new coalition that will be sworn in probably within the next 2.5, 3 weeks, will be tested either by Hezbollah from the north, maybe by Hamas in Gaza, maybe by Palestinians in the West Bank, and maybe, as some Israeli commentators expressed in the Israeli media, even the Israelis themselves will take to the streets to protest against the government. But I can tell you that based on past experiences that we've had before, I think that this government will be judged by its actions. Okay. The best example is
The education.
The Ehud Olmert government in 2006 was immediately tested by Hezbollah, if you remember.
Yeah.
And the Israeli reaction was very harsh, and we've had more or less a quiet front.
Right, but let's talk about
Hezbollah.
inside Israel right now, which is what people are very, very curious about. Now, apparently, this very far-right Noam party, its leader, Avi Moaz, will be in control of education policy. He's called for IDF advisory unit regarding the status of women to be abolished, whatever that means. We've seen things like that in places like Afghanistan and all the rest of it. Party is also anti-LGBTQ, supports increasing ultra-Orthodox values in the educational system. More than 50 local authorities around Israel have announced that they will not cooperate with these policies. So where does that leave the country? What happens?
This is a very interesting story, because this fellow that you mentioned, his name, is not going to hold the educational portfolio, but he demanded within the coalition agreement, which made public yesterday, to have authority over one particular unit within the Ministry of Education that is in charge of what we call external curriculum, extracurricular programs. And he was quoted as saying that through those extracurricular programs, foreign governments influence our children. That's his argument. And the very, very interesting, the reaction not only of Israeli municipal leaders, but also of the leaders of the trade union. The trade union of the teachers.
Unions, yeah.
The teachers'
They're not going
unions.
To
The head of it was a very powerful trade union, perhaps one of the most powerful trade unions in Israel. And our viewers should know that Israel trade unions are very powerful still. And he said this is not going to fly. And so the reaction of the Israeli system to that particular element of the agreement is very harsh, unusually harsh.
So let's go back again. The very well-known and best-selling author Yuval Noah Harari, I've interviewed several times, including just last month, has talked about this. This is what he told me about what the actual election result actually means that Israelis want for their country.
A lot of the Israeli public has gradually switched from a belief in the two-state solution to at least an implicit belief in the three classes solution, that you have just one country between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean with three classes of people living there, Jews who have all the rights, some Arabs who have some rights, and other Arabs who have very little or no rights.
So he's talking about a segregated nation. Do you agree with that? Do you think that is what people have voted for and that's what's coming down the pike?
There are many ways to look at the outcome of the elections. When you look at the popular vote, it's practically mathematically 50-50. When you look at the positions, you have about 80 members of the Knesset that are right of center and 40 that are left of center. When you look at the level of religiosity, Jews and Muslims, you have almost 60 members of the Knesset that are either very religious or ultra-religious. There are many ways to look at it, and obviously the coalition is 64-56. What Professor Harari was referring to is the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I think, again, as an observer, that the attempts to basically eliminate the green line and to say, you know, the West Bank is open for Israelis, the Israelis voted with their feet. You don't see mass migration of Israelis to the West Bank. You would think that you would have millions of Israelis living in the West Bank. It's not happening. And I think that Harari is right in some of the things that he's saying, but I think that the two-state solution is probably, in the eyes of the majority of the Israelis, the most viable solution on the table.
We shall see. Thank you so much for your valuable perspective, Ido Aharoni,
Thank you for having me.
Former Consul General in New York. Thank you so much.